have two amazing speakers. So Paul Kim is a district attorney with the LA District Attorney's Office and specializes in hate crimes. And I will probably butcher because I know you have a really long, kind of background and stuff. So I'll let you introduce a little bit about yourself. And then Sean Gillespie, who I will let Sean introduce himself because I'm not even sure what is going to be the proper way to introduce that. But Sean has an amazing background and story. And so throughout today, again, it's just to learn kind of again about hate crimes and then obviously somebody who's been there. And if you guys have, questions or anything like that, I know both of them are very open to questions. So if you guys have anything, just let us know or type them in the chat and we will go with that. So with that, Paul, I will turn it over to you.
Okay. Hello, everyone. How are you? My name is Paul Kim, and I'm a deputy DA in the hate crimes unit. I'm also the only DA in the county that prosecutes human trafficking cases involving forced labor. I've been doing this for 7 years. Prior to this, I was in what was known back then as our hardcore gang division, and I prosecuted gang murder trials for 9 years before that. I want to thank Bethany and Megan for letting me join you all today to share with you a little bit about what my unit does, what sort of cases we take, and the sorts of community-based outreach that we do like this to try to keep the public informed when it comes to hate crimes. So the hate crime unit is comprised of 3 DAs, and we vertically prosecute all serious hate crimes that happen within the county of Los Angeles. This includes obviously any case that involves grave bodily injury or death, any case that involves an organized hate group, and cases that end up in the media or have particularly complex issues. In addition, we do the law enforcement training for a lot of our partner agencies, including the hate crime coordinators for LAPD, the hate crime coordinators for LA Sheriff's Department, and our local agency partners. I just did training for the Torrance Police Department recently. We also work closely with our community-based organizations. I did hate crime training over the weekend for the Korean Court Interpreters Association. We did a public service announcement with the Korean American Coalition, and we try to work closely with our community stakeholders because, as you know, there has been, an uptick in hate crimes, certainly an uptick in awareness of hate crimes and an uptick in reporting of hate crimes. And we try to make sure that we stay involved and try to assist any way that we can. So that having been said, I want to share with you a PowerPoint that I have that will explain to you sort of what the hate crimes are. Let me see here, share screen. So can everyone see my screen here? Megan, did it pop up? Yes, okay.
Oh, I'm muted, yes.
Okay, fantastic. So this is something that I use regularly in the trainings, and a lot of times people have questions as to what a hate crime is. So let's jump right into it. A hate crime is a criminal act or an attempted criminal act by a person or group directed against an individual, a group of persons, or property because of the victim's actual or perceived, and these are the factors that are listed in Penal Code 422.55. It can be race or ethnicity, which includes color, ancestry, or ethnic background. It includes gender, which can be sex, gender identity or gender expression, disability, which is mental or physical as defined in the government code, nationality, which is citizenship, country of origin, nation of origin, religion, belief, observance or practice, sexual orientation, and association with a person or group with one or more of these protected characteristics. And this association covers individuals that do advocacy on behalf of any one of these groups that we just mentioned, individuals that work at these locations, and individuals that the offender perceives to be part of the protected class. Even if the individual isn't a member of the protected class, if the offender believes the individual is a member of that protected class, then the hate crime statute kicks in. And really, in a nutshell, what the hate crime statute does is it operates in two ways. One, it is a substantive standalone crime as a misdemeanor. I'll get into that in a little bit. But really what we deal with here at the DA's office, because we mainly handle felonies, we work with our partner agencies like the Los Angeles City Attorney's Office. We have a memorandum of understanding with them. We try to ensure that we work closely with the LA City Attorney's Office when it comes to prosecuting hate crimes. But the city of Los Angeles has 4 million citizens out of 11 plus million here in the county. So a great deal of the misdemeanor hate crime violations are handled directly by the LA City Attorney's Office. Now, we also work closely with our federal partners as well. You may or may not know, but the federal government is what's known as a dual sovereign. And what that means is if there's a crime that's committed within the county of Los Angeles and it's prosecuted by me or any other prosecutorial agency, the federal government has their own independent sovereignty. They can file that case on their own, independent of what decision we make here at the state level. Even if a jury returns a verdict, the federal government, they still have their own sovereignty. And they have some tools available to them that we don't have. For example, interfering with a peaceful protest is a violation of federal law, but that's not a violation of state law. And you'd be surprised the number of instances where that would be a helpful tool. And the feds certainly have that at their disposal. But really what we deal with here, what I deal with, are felonies. And the best way to look at the hate crime statute when it comes to felonies is you look at the crime that was committed. It could be a robbery, it could be a burglary, it could be a murder, it can just be an assault with a deadly weapon. The felony hate crime statute isn't a standalone crime. There's no, oh, you committed a hate crime per se. What it is an enhancement. It's added on top of the crime. And it could be, the other types of enhancements that we have are like gang enhancements, elder abuse enhancements. There are different enhancements that we use in narcotics when it comes to certain weights. So an enhancement is something that is added to the crime. It's not a standalone crime by itself. And I want to focus on that because I want everyone here to understand when it comes to hate crime prosecutions as felonies, what you're doing is you're saying to the offender, we are going to ask the jury to make a factual finding that this crime is a hate crime, which means you targeted this victim for this crime. That's what's being punished. It's the selection of the victim based upon any of these characteristics that you see right here on the screen right now. So if I'm going to commit a robbery and I decide, well, I'm going to focus on individuals because of their race, because of their sexual orientation, because of their religious belief, and I'm going to target that individual, then that's when the hate crime comes in. You've already got a crime that's been committed, but it's the targeting of the victim because of the protected characteristic that the law prohibits. So I'd like to start off with that because a lot of times when we're talking about hate crimes in general, the way we talk to each other, lay people, sometimes we'll hear about something and think, well, that must certainly be a hate crime. But oftentimes it's really a hate incident. So what's a hate incident? A hate incident is just non-criminal conduct that's motivated by bias. I could say something to you. I could use terrible words and say something to you because of your ethnicity or your race. I could choose to say, well, I don't like where you worship and I don't like who you love. As long as I don't commit a crime when I do that, and I'm not interfering with your civil rights, which we'll get into in a second, which is a standalone misdemeanor crime, then the First Amendment prohibits it. The First Amendment is what? The First Amendment deals with freedom of speech, freedom of expression, and freedom of association. In this country, you can say things that are hurtful. You can say things that are bigoted. You can say things that are biased, racist. The First Amendment protects that. If you want to be a member of the KKK, if you want to be the member of the National Socialist Organization, the Nazi Party, the First Amendment permits that. If you want to associate with individuals that are a member of these groups. The First Amendment protects that. What the First Amendment doesn't protect is it respects your right to say what you want to say, up until the point that that right infringes upon somebody else's right to be free from you expressing a desire to create great bodily injury or harm. You can say, I hate you, and I hate the way that you are, and I hate the way you believe, and I hate the way you think. That's okay. But you can't say on top of that, and because of that, I'm going to hurt you, I'm going to shoot you, I'm going to kill you. Because now you're putting somebody's, their freedom to be who they are, their freedom to express themselves, their freedom to associate, you're infringing upon their civil rights. So that's kind of the nutshell version of what a hate crime is. And that's why we have so many hate incidents where people are frustrated, and you you hear about it on the news and you think, wow, what a terribly racist comment. What a bigoted comment. But that comment is permitted under the First Amendment. So when does it become a crime? When does hate become a crime? As far as prohibited vice, what we're looking at when we come to the felony hate crime allegation that I was explaining, which is you're targeting somebody for the crime because of the protected characteristic, and you're expressing that bias animus by targeting this group, the standard is a substantial motivating factor. That prohibited bias, my hate for your race or your ethnicity, my hate for your faith, my hate for your sexual orientation or your gender, that must be a substantial motivating factor. And I think a good example to give is the murders that occurred in Atlanta last year. As many of you know, that brought a certain amount of awareness to the AAPI community, and to just share a personal note for you, it affected me in a unique way too. My parents are both in their 70s, and they like to take the bus, and there were a lot of incidents that occurred where elderly Asians were being targeted and attacked at subways and bus stops. And until that point, I'd never heard my mother say to me, I'm scared to go outside. I'm afraid somebody's going to target me because we're Asian. And it wasn't until that I thought, wow, this is how hate operates. This is how hate infects a community. It's not just a person that's targeted. It's all their friends. It's their families. It's every member of that community. And that's why this administration takes the prosecution of hate crimes so seriously. It's a very important to Mr. Gascon that this unit and this office prosecutes hate crimes to the fullest extent of the law, because Mr. Gascon wants to ensure that we stem the rise of hate crimes in LA. And I bring up the Atlanta incident because I wanted to, again, share. I think sometimes the best way to look at things is by contrasting things. At the first thing that the FBI said after the Atlanta murders was, this is not a hate crime. Do you all remember that? I mean, surely some of you must have thought, wait, how can this not be a hate crime? And I remember when that came out, that's what my mom said to me. How is this not a hate crime? And the federal standard is very different. Where here I have a substantial factor test, which means it is a cause in fact, one of many causes. There may be multiple motivations. It may be because, like the Atlanta person, there was some sort of strange sexual thing that was going on. It may be he was targeting Asian women, and maybe he was just targeting women. But under the federal statute, it must be the only cause. So the reason those women were killed would have to be, the only reason would have to be because of the hate motivated bias. And the FBI said, well, there are multiple reasons here, which is why about a year later, the state attorney said, well, we're going to prosecute this as a hate crime. Again, we're separate sovereigns. So you can go on a state track with the prosecution, you can go on a federal track with the prosecution, but we have different standards, and the federal standard is much higher than the state standard. And so I say that just to give you some sense of why it is sometimes that different prosecutorial agencies can arrive at different conclusions about how to move forward with prosecutions. Oops. So Penal Code 422.75, which is the sentencing enhancement that we're talking about, states that any person who commits or attempts to commit a felony as a hate crime, and it is found true by the trier of fact that this was in fact a bias motivated incident, then that person shall receive an additional 1, 2, or 3 years in state prison. That's strange. It's 1, 2, or 3 years that you get on top of whatever you were going to get for whatever that crime might have been. And just out of curiosity, what do you think the most common hate crime is that we deal with generally? On the whole, is generally vandalism. And I'll talk to you a little bit about some of the reasons why some cases aren't prosecuted. A lot of times, when a vandalism occurs and it's a hateful act, it could be at a synagogue, it could be at a school, it could be on somebody's garage. Sometimes there are no suspects. Sometimes there's no evidence, there's no leads. So that's why in some instances, when people say, oh, well, I don't feel like law enforcement, did a good job with that incident. There are occasions where we do have good leads. There are occasions when you have witnesses, and sometimes you have ring cameras and other tools to help you assist with the identification. But sometimes there aren't. And but if it's a felony vandalism, and that is any amount over $400, then we can get an extra 1, 2, or 3 years in state prison. Now, what if 2 or more people commit a crime? In this instance, if you do it in concert with another, you can receive an additional 2, 3, or 4 years in state prison. So let's say it's an assault with a deadly weapon. The general standard is 16, 2, or 3 years. If 2 people were to commit that assault, it's a group assault. And the trier of fact makes a finding that that assault was motivated substantially by some sort of bias animus, then we can get an additional 2, 3, or 4 years in state prison as the sentencing tool. The hate crime special allegation is a factor in aggravation. So personal use of a firearm in the commission of offense is considered a factor in aggravation. And if you have a prior hate crime conviction, then and it's pled and proven, then we get an additional 1 year in prison for each prior felony conviction as well. And just to talk a little bit, because this is a question that comes up a lot with the community groups that I speak with. The question I get asked frequently is, they'll say, Paul, what do we do? I mean, should we always report these hate crimes? What if we don't have a suspect, or we do? What if we don't feel like it rises to the level of crime? It's just a hate incident. Should we still report the hate crime? And the answer to that question that I want all of you to know is yes, resoundingly. Always report the incident, even if you don't feel it rises to the level of a crime, because there are tools available like Evidence Code Section 1101B, which is uncharged misconduct. You can use, there's a prohibition in the law. You can't say, oh, this person committed a crime in the past, so he has a propensity to commit crime. That's not allowed. That's impermissible character evidence. However, 1101B does allow the introduction of incidents that don't rise to the level of a conviction, but aren't being used to prove conduct and conformity. We're not saying you're a bad person then, you must be a bad person now. What it's saying is you can use other incidents to show something else than conduct and conformity. For example, to prove identity, who the individual was. It could be important to show an MO. It could be important to show intent that the individual, he or she's actually targeting the victim because of the protected characteristic. And we can use something that doesn't rise to the level of crime to say, this happened, at this time. And even though this individual wasn't arrested, and even though this individual wasn't prosecuted, this person is willing to come into court and say, I remember that guy. Yeah, he did all these terrible things to me and was criticizing me because of my race or my sexual orientation. And that would be admissible evidence to show that the individual in the case that he is being prosecuted for had the requisite intent, which is to target somebody because of their protected characteristic. This is something I talk about, it seems like it must be applied, but it's not, it's mandatory. A court, it sounds mandatory, but it's not. The court has discretion under 422.75 to state, you know what, I'm finding that there are mitigating circumstances here, and I'm not going to impose the extra 1, 2, or 3, or 2, 3, or 4 years. But has to, one, make a finding that there are mitigating circumstances in order to do that, and two, must state the reasons on the record, saying this is why I'm making this finding. You know, there's an evolution in the hate crime statute, and one of the things that a hate crime prosecution permits is it permits the use of the hate crime as a special circumstance, which means it can be used to try and find the defendant, have the jury make a finding that a special circumstance is true, which is necessary in order to impose certain sentences, obviously the death penalty, which this office is no longer pursuing, and life without the possibility of parole. Now, it's interesting because if you look at the penal code for special circumstances, sexual orientation and disability are not included, but we saw earlier in the slide that I showed you that those are both protected characteristics. And so I just wanted to let you know that this statute has gone through some evolution since it was first enacted. In 1992, the statute was amended so that disability became a protected characteristic. In 1994, the statute was amended to include the word perceives, which means now you can be wrong. You can say, well, that I don't have to prove that the individual actually is disabled or actually is African American or actually is a woman for that particular finding to be true. As long as I can prove that the defendant perceived that person was a member of the protected class, that's enough. And obviously the reason that these statutes have been amended, or there have been instances where a prosecutor's been in a situation and he's prosecuting or she is prosecuting a case as a hate crime, and the victim will say, oh, but I'm not a member of that class. As long as we can show through the introduction of evidence that the defendant perceived that the victim was a member of that class, then the hate crime statute is applicable. And that happened in 1994. In 1997, place of worship was added. In 1998, gender was amended to be included, including gender identity. And 2004, there was the court was given discretion. So this gives you an idea of sort of the evolution of the hate crime statute. And I suspect at some point that the special circumstance allegation may be amended as well to include some of the catch-all provisions that are allowed under the hate crime statute when it comes to prosecuting hate crimes, but aren't included when it comes to making a finding of a special circumstance to be true. Now, Penal Code 422.6 is the standalone hate crime. And when I say standalone hate crime, I mean, it's the violation all by itself. Again, when it comes to felonies, what did we learn? There's no standalone crime. It's something you add on top of the crime because the defendant was targeting people who had that protected characteristic. 422.6 is interference with somebody's civil rights. It's a standalone misdemeanor. And if you read the statute by itself, which is the willfully intimidate, interfere with, oppress, or threaten somebody's free exercise or enjoyment of any right or privilege secured to him or her by the Constitution, the laws of the state, or the laws of the United States, it sounds confusing. And I think that's deliberate and by design that it was left intentionally vague by the courts, because the way the courts interpret this particular statute is when we're talking about the free exercise or enjoyment of any right or privilege, it's not like I have to find somewhere in the Bill of Rights or the Constitution that you have a constitutional right to go to work, that you have a constitutional right to go to have a wedding, that you have a constitutional right to enjoy a public park, that you have a constitutional right to ride a city bus. Because if you look for that constitutional right, you're not going to find it anywhere. But this language and the free exercise and enjoyment of any right or privilege is any commonly known right or privilege. And I'm confident we could all agree that if there are 12 people sitting in a jury box, all of those members of those juries would say, you know what, as an American citizen, you have the right to use a public park. And you have the right to try to, go to work. And if you want to take a city bus and somebody's interfering with your right to take a city bus because they don't like your race or your ethnicity or who you're choosing to love or where you're choosing to worship, then that's a crime. And that's a standalone crime. 422.6b is the same thing, but this covers property. So 422.6a is protecting persons. 422.6b is protecting property. This includes, the classical case on this is in Ray Michael M. And in that case, the defendant drew a noose and did some other racist graffiti to the door of a school, to a classroom actually. And the teacher of that classroom was African-American, and many students that attended that classroom were African-American. And what the court held was that classroom was so closely associated with the teacher and the students that the court made a finding that that could be a standalone hate crime because their use of that classroom is a civil right. You have the right to go to school. So that's kind of how the misdemeanor statute works. If you look for the specific provision, you're not going to find it in the Constitution, but it's one of those things that are so well known that 12 people can all agree, and that's who makes all our decisions in this country, or 12 of our peers. They would all agree, you know what, that's a civil right, and you have a right to do that, and anyone knows that you have that right. The law does not forbid us from using our common sense. Sometimes we think the law is so particular and so specific, we lose sight of the fact that it's actually designed to be quite common sensible and excuse me, easily understood. Because if the law wasn't easily understood, then all of us would run the risk of running afoul of it on a regular basis. So there are some factors that we have to focus on when it comes to misdemeanor hate crimes. A misdemeanor hate crime can be punished as a felony. And that's an interesting thing. A misdemeanor, by its definition, means that the maximum amount of time that can be imposed is 365 days in county jail. But Penal Code 422.7 gives prosecutors the option, where appropriate, to state, you know what, this crime was so egregious and the conduct so outrageous that we're going to ask this court to give felony sentencing. Think about that. 16, 2 or 3 years. So in order to use this section, we have to prove right here 1, 2, or 3 things. One, that at the time, if it's a crime against a person, the offender had the present ability to commit violent injury or actually caused physical injury, or if it's against property. 2, the offender caused property damage greater than $950, which is interesting because a felony vandalism only requires you to prove that it was over $400 in damages. Or 3 is sort of a status-related issue. If the individual has committed a prior hate crime, then we can try to use this tool, 422.7, to essentially elevate the misdemeanor into a felony. This question here is something I generally ask prosecutors when I'm giving this lecture to prosecutors. There's a couple other areas I wanted to spend on educating this group on. Hate crime victims are entitled to a protective order, and it protects them from harassment, any conduct, or any communication or contact by the offender. Any violation of this court order may be prosecuted as a misdemeanor or a felony, or as a contempt of court. Penal Code 139 states it's a felony when somebody already convicted of a felony commutes a credible threat or violence to a witness, to a victim, or their immediate families. It's interesting if you go down these. This is something that I don't think we necessarily need to focus on these. Again, some of these sections are meant for other trainings, but it is interesting because if you look at Penal Code Section 185, which is the 4th one down there, prior to the pandemic, it was a misdemeanor for any person to wear any mask to escape discovery. I want to spend some time on Penal Code 584.3. It allows a prosecutor to seek felony sentencing if the place that is vandalized is a place of worship. And this is something that we deal with a lot. We've dealt with at various churches and synagogues and temples in the neighborhood across the county. But we do have to prove one thing. We have to prove that it is hate motivated. It's not just the fact that you committed a vandalism at a church. It's the fact that you targeted that church because it's a place of worship. So that is something important that people need to consider. Penal Code 11411 makes it a misdemeanor to display racist signs on the property of another. This includes a swastika, a noose, any commonly known symbol of hate. Penal Code 412 states it's a felony to attempt to discourage religious activities or to exercise of religion by threats of violence. And Penal Code 11413 states it's a felony to use a bomb or to set on fire a place of worship. I'm going to jump to another outline real quick. And Megan, how much time did I have? How much time do I have left? Because I'm very eager to hear Mr. Gillespie too.
Like 5-10 more minutes, yeah.
Okay. In that case, let me wrap up by stating that I hope I've been able to help educate this group on the difference between hate incidents and hate crimes. I hope I've been able to clarify that for you. I hope that I've been able to help you get an understanding of the actual statutes and how we make these filing decisions here in this office. I wanted to spend one moment on that. It's something that I don't know if I have a slide for earlier, but I don't think I do. No, I don't. Sometimes the community will hear about an incident or a crime, and I state this because if anything else, I want to leave this group with an understanding of the difference between a hate incident and a hate crime. Sometimes, though, the questions I get from community-based groups that I speak to, like this organization, sometimes are, well, we heard about this in the news, and you can put in whatever incident is. How come your office didn't file a case? And I'm confident that there will be at least some people that are members of this group that have been in that situation as well. My role as a prosecutor, and any prosecutor's role, is to seek justice. And that means respecting the rights of the accused as much as the rights of the victim. What that means is, as a prosecutor, I have an ethical duty to only file cases that I believe I can prove beyond a reasonable doubt to 12 people. That's the standard. If you wonder, well, what's the DA, how's this DA going to make this decision whether or not to file a case? That's the standard any DA is going to use, which is, can I prove this case beyond a reasonable doubt to 12 people? If you're confident that you can, that there is enough admissible evidence to move forward with the criminal prosecution, then you file a case. Once you file that case, is in this instance a complaint, all sorts of things happen. As soon as that complaint is signed by the district attorney, the criminal action has commenced. The Sixth Amendment kicks in. The accused is entitled to counsel. The Fifth Amendment kicks in. The accused is entitled to remain silent, and the accused is entitled to confront and cross-examine the witnesses that are against him. The accused is entitled to use the subpoena power of the court to compel the testimony of witnesses who may have a favorable side or exculpatory evidence to present. But that's something that I always try to convey at the community-based level, is the standard, which is, will 12 people beyond a reasonable doubt return a verdict of guilty? So that having been said, I'd like to open the floor to any questions. Megan, would any of your members like to ask me any of the questions about what we've been discussing here today?
Yes, thank you so much. This is a lot of information. I did get one question, if you can share the PowerPoint, because it is a lot of information. So I did get that. But I will open it up. Yeah, anyone else have any other questions for Paul?
I do. Do you want me to put it in the chat, or do you want me to say it out loud?
Shout it out. Yeah, Go for it,
I
Matthew.
have not been looking at the chat. Should I be looking at the chat?
No, you're fine.
Oh, I wanted to say, you know, when it comes to a hate crime against a specific gender, whether it's a woman committing a crime against a man or vice versa, how are you able to differentiate that over domestic violence?
That's a great question, Bethany. And I think the best way to look at it is to look at it as a Venn diagram. A crime can encompass more than one. If you're talking about domestic violence, you're talking about using force or violence against somebody that you're in a relationship with or you're cohabitating with. You can be in a relationship with somebody and still target them for a hate crime because you're upset. If you strike, let's say, your roommate or your partner, when you slap the person, you mentioned, well, I'm doing this because you're a woman, or I'm doing this because of your race. Then you've just committed two crimes. You've committed a domestic violence because you're in a relationship with this person, and you've also committed a hate crime because you chose to hit that person. As long as you can prove, right, that one of the motivating factors was because, yeah, you know what, I'm hitting you because of this protected characteristic. And that's really what it comes down to. Just because it can fall under the Venn diagram doesn't necessarily mean it proves the crime. Really, what we're after here is the truth, and justice is all about the truth. Is there sufficient evidence so that 12 reasonable people from the community could agree, you know what, he wasn't or she wasn't hitting their partner just because of their anger? It really was because they were upset about their race or their ethnicity or some other protected characteristic. Does that answer the question, Bethany?
It does, very much so. Thank you.
Of course.
Looks like David has a question.
Mr. Sachs, do you have your hand up, sir?
I have my electronic hand up. If you'd like to see my other hand, it's right here. I've got a question about an incident that I was involved with 2 years ago. And the reason that I can specify the time is because it took place during our High Holy Days. I was working the curb, helping people out of their cars so they could come into services. And a guy walked up, and to this day, I remember what he looked like. Temperature was about 90 some odd degrees. He had his right hand in his pocket. And he stopped in front of me and he said, "Do you go here?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "The Jews hate Jesus." And I said, perhaps stupidly, "No, we don't." He said, "Yes, the Jews hate Jesus." Now, there's a coda to the story, but I'm going to stop it at this point to ask you the question. Is that a hate incident? Is the fact that he had his hand in his pocket, does that make it a hate crime, or does it make it a nothing, just a slur?
Based upon the facts that you've told me, Mr. Sachs, which is he didn't threaten you with any great bodily injury or violence, correct?
Correct.
All he said was, that he felt that Jews hate Jesus.
Correct.
And he had his hand in his pocket, I presume, to intimidate you. And I presume you felt he put his hand in his pocket to intimidate you, correct?
Well, let me put it to you this way. I'm 5'4". This guy was about 6'2". His pocket was a little bit below the level of my neck. Yeah, it was a little intimidating.
That is a terrible incident, but without the words or the conduct associated with those words, it would not rise to the level of a crime, Mr. Sachs. That would simply be a hate incident because he didn't threaten you. He didn't threaten you physically in any fashion.
Correct.
And verbally, it didn't rise to the level of a crime because it didn't threaten you with great bodily injury or death.
Okay. So,
but if you know who that person is, again, if you were to report that, and this is very important, who would you report that to? Does anyone know? 211. Have you all heard of 211? Have you heard of the LA versus Hate organization? 211 is a great organization. That's a reporting forum that you can just dial, just like you would dial 311 to get a pothole fixed in the street. 211 is a reporting forum that's maintained by the LA County Commission on Human Relations with many of their partner groups, and they'll ensure a couple of things. One, they'll document the date, time, and incident. If there's a physical description of the person, if there's a license plate. Whenever we're talking about documentation, it's kind of one of those instances where you try to remember everything you can about the person, everything you can about the car. You try to get the details if you can, a name, a license plate, and that would be inputted into the system. And that does two things. One, it makes sure that it's recorded and reflected. But two, Mr. Sachs, let's say that had been so emotionally disturbing to you that you require some counseling or some sort of some sort of assistance. 211 would have partner organizations that would be able to give you the assistance that you need, including counseling.
That's good to know. Thank you.
Absolutely.
So I was going to say, well, we have one question in the chat, but then we'll take Irving as the last question for time. But then the question in the chat that was in Orange County, does it 211 also be the resource? Do you know? Or is that just LA?
I'm going to look into that question. I
was going to say,
suspect
we can look into that too, yeah.
I suspect it's just Los Angeles because it's the Los Angeles County Commission on Human Relations, but I know the Orange County Commission on Human Relations is an outstanding organization too. So I suspect there might be a similar resource available for members of the Orange County community.
Perfect, we can look at that. Okay, Irv, last question.
Okay, thanks. With regards to reporting an incident or crime, is there a time limits or statute of limitation when somebody can, file an incident or report it?
For a felony, there is a 3-year statute of limitations for most crimes. Some crimes have greater statute of limitations because if the sentence can be over 6 years, and there can be a 6-year statute of limitation, let's say for attempted murder or something like that. On the whole, the vast majority of the type of cases that we're going to be dealing, law enforcement will have a 3-year statute of limitation, like meaning a prosecutor has 3 years or it just expires. As far as reporting, there is no statute of limitations as far as reporting the incident. But I do feel it's best to try to report the incident as soon as possible, because that's when your memory and your recollection of the events are going to be crispest. And that's really when law enforcement, if the information flows to law enforcement, where it'll be useful, so that law enforcement say, we're getting sort of a spike in this little area right over here of hateful incidents. Maybe we want to direct more resources here. So it works in two ways. It works, I think, as a cathartic measure for the victim. It is good to share it immediately. And secondly, for law enforcement, we're going to get more accurate information, and it can help us when it comes to trying to nip the situation in the bud before it snowballs into something more serious.
Thank you so much, Paul. This is great information. We really appreciate
Absolutely.
it. I was like, I learned a lot, so that's exciting as well. Perfect. So kind of transitioning on a little bit, I'm sure a lot of you guys have seen maybe a little snippet on Sean's background. And as you guys will hear, as I introduce Sean, he's a lot more than just that one small incident that he, committed. And so kind of the importance of having this as well, right, is so one that we're really learning what constitutes a hate crime. Because I know a lot of times people are like, oh, that's a hate crime, and really realizing, as Paul just shared, that not all things are one, that easy to prosecute, or two, even fall under that statute. And then two, the other half of this, right, is to hear somebody who's been there, and now obviously has done a lot to, change his life and turn his life around to kind of where he's at now, and while he's not a client of H.I.R.E's, right, this is the importance of organizations such as ours and, a lot of yours on this call as well, right, to be able to help link people with resources, to help them deal with, past traumas or help them deal with things in their past. So that way they are able now, to continue on and contribute positively. So I won't go too much into Sean's story because I'll let him tell you his full story, but I will turn it over to Sean Gillespie.
Hello. Thank you, Megan. Hi, my name is Sean Gillespie. I'm a former Hammerskin and member of the Aryan Nations. And in 2004, I was not convicted of a hate crime. I was charged federally with the firebombing of a Jewish synagogue It easily could have been a hate crime, in my opinion, should have been. I did not get charged with a hate crime though, because my sentence length would have been lesser than the mandatory firearms sentence that I was ultimately charged with, which was overturned. But where would you like me to start, Megan? Just about my story, or?
Yeah, you can just tell us your story, like again, how you got there and what you're doing now.
All right, I grew up in Spokane, Washington. That's where I currently live. I had a pretty tumultuous childhood. My parents divorced when I was roughly 2. I was born addicted to drugs because my mother was using drugs when she was pregnant. I want to say at the age of 4 or 5, custody was given to my father for $350 so my mom could go down to Reno and Vegas with my stepfather. And so I was raised by a single father, and I had a pretty good childhood. I mean, he wasn't always there because, he worked 3 jobs. But when I was 8 years old, I was molested and raped by an Asian male. It was a Korean man. And so I began to hate Asians and homosexuals at the time. And I blamed them for what had happened to me. And I didn't really tell anybody because although my family isn't racist or racial at all, I actually come from a pretty diverse family. I felt that, they were pretty conservative. So I felt that by me being raped and molested by a man, that it somehow made me homosexual. I was a kid. I was kind of just scared of how my family would react if I told them this. So I had a lot of behavioral issues in school, and I was placed in state-run group homes. And while I was at the group homes, I began hanging out with older kids and running away, using drugs from the age of maybe 11 to 12. And at the age of 12, I threw a rock off an overpass and was placed in a juvenile detention facility. And while I was there, I shoved a guard and tried to bite another one. And they sent me for 2 years in the juvenile justice system. And while I was there, I didn't really fit in with like the black or Mexican gangs. So I kind of just was having a lot of issues with bullying because, I was outnumbered by those. And I started hanging around with a lot of punk rockers prior to going there. And I had heard about Aryan nations while I was there. I was reading an article because there was a shooting in Los Angeles at the time of an individual named Buford Furrow in Los Angeles, who was a member of Aryan Nations. And I read an article about Aryan Nations, and I'd like the military. So it was easy for me to consider them a military organization. And so when I was released at the age of 15, I stole a bike and I rode it from Spokane, Washington to the old Aryan Nations compound in Hayden Lake, Idaho. It's about 40 minutes drive. So I'm sure you can imagine it's a pretty long trek on a bicycle. And I went up there and they took me in immediately. They gave me a surrogate family, if you will. I mean, they indoctrinated me as well because I wasn't raised racist. I didn't know any people who were Jewish. I didn't know anybody who was homosexual other than the guy who abused me. I didn't know a lot of different cultures. I came from an area that was relatively, for the most part, white. And so it wasn't something that I had been around. And so I believed everything these people told me because they told me that the reason I was abused was the Jews' fault because the Jews controlled the media and the media perverted this guy who abused me. And as a 15-year-old kid who's just full of anger and hate, it was really easy to just say, okay, that's it. That's the solution to my problems. And now I'm in a war against that. And so I stayed at the Aryan Nations compound prior to them. It's now been taken away. I actually just went up to film a documentary this weekend, and it's a tree farm, believe it or not. So it's kind of interesting to see how it's changed. But during high school, I just continued to become, just more and more radicalized with the skinhead stuff, passed out literature. My family really tried to take me in, but my aunt believes that I was brainwashed by this point. And I think she's correct. I think there was largely, these people, they provided a family, but they didn't provide structure and like love like a true family will, because my aunt tried to take me in and give me a normal, life and household. But by that time I lived on the streets under bridges. I had shot heroin, and it was like, you're going to give me a normal life. But I did stop using drugs, because that was one thing that the skinheads I hung out with in Aryan Nations were really big on. They're different than a lot of, like, say, white prison gangs who do drugs, like the California Aryan Brotherhood or Nazi Lowrider. Their whole organization isn't necessarily based on Nazism. It's more based on drugs and protection within the prison system and a criminal organization. We considered ourselves better than that. We were a movement. We had ideals and values. Although, to be frank, a lot of those people do not follow those. So throughout high school, I committed small hate crimes, assaults, vandalism, as Mr. Kim was saying, is very common, harassment. And in 2002, in 2001, I joined the United States Army. And while I was in the Army waiting to go to basic training, because I was finishing my senior year, I was arrested for protesting the Martin Luther King parade in Spokane. And I was not charged with a hate crime, but I was charged with, in Washington State, it's called malicious harassment, which is the same as if you were to burn a cross in somebody's yard. However, that was dismissed in lieu of me being charged with disorderly conduct. And I was allowed to go to basic training with U.S. Army. And I went in the Army and was eventually discharged. I got an honorable discharge that, quite frankly, I didn't deserve, because I was discharged for violation of the Army's Equal Opportunity Program for being a member of a hate group and for being very vocal about being a member of a hate group. I used racial slurs. I did not deserve an honorable discharge. The only thing that saved me is I had a lot of people fighting for me, because I was, by all other accounts, a really good soldier. After I got out of the Army, I decided that I was going to go around the country and do hate crimes. I felt I was being pressured by the FBI. I was working at Taco Bell, and the FBI came in and started questioning me. So I felt like I was 20 years old. I felt like my life was over. So basically, I got a truck and I started driving around the country doing hate crimes. I scouted out a synagogue in Las Vegas, Nevada. However, I honestly chickened out, because there was a heavy police presence, and I didn't feel like it was going to be an easy target for me to do. And I just went around, I committed assaults. And then in 2004, during this, I went to Temple B'nai Israel in Oklahoma City, and I threw a Molotov cocktail at the temple. I caused roughly $250 in damage. And about 2 weeks later, somebody that I'd known for 3 years, he was a federal informant. Unbeknownst to me, he turned me in, and I was, yes, I did pick Oklahoma City because of Timothy McVeigh. Bethany, thank you for your question. I was inspired by him, like a lot of white supremacists are at the time. Although I didn't really know much about it because it happened when I was a child. So, but I was ultimately sentenced. I wasn't charged with a hate crime. Like I said, I was charged with a statute, 924 C1A, which has since been invalidated under a U.S. Supreme Court case called U.S. v. Davis, at least the residual clause within it, which was what I was charged with, which was like how they define a crime of violence in short. And so was sentenced to 39 years. And as I was being sentenced, I gave a Nazi salute. And my victim, Rabbi Barry Cohen, spoke at my sentencing, and he asked that I do not be placed in an environment where white supremacists would applaud my crime. I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but that was essentially his message. And that was not followed. I was immediately sent to USP Florence in Colorado, which at the time was one of the most racially segregated federal prisons. Like, it was extremely violent. I mean, in 2008, we had a 200-man race riot there. And the first thing that happened when I got out into the yard was I was given a packet. No, I didn't go to Coleman first, Bethany. I was given a packet of white power literature, shower sandals, and a radio. And I was on a yard with several people who were basically the big dogs in the white supremacist movement, not the prison gang movement, because there was a few of those people as well, but David Lane, who was the founder of the 14 words. He's the one who, the 14 words are something that are used by skinheads and white supremacists. It stands for, we must secure the existence of our race and a future for white children. Sometimes race is interchanged with people depending on who you're talking to. David Lane was serving time for the murder of a Jewish radio talk show host named Alan Berg from the 80s with a group of people called The Order. And David Lane and all these people did applaud my crime. And I was treated as a hero on the yard. I was not treated as somebody who had committed a vile act, which is what I should have been. For the first 4 years of my prison thing, I was extremely violent. Anybody who's been to prison will tell you, at least federal prison, I don't know, like state prison, it's changed now, but back then it was like you could be violent. You could stab somebody and you're out of the hole in a week. You're beating people with padlocks. There's no consequences. They take your phone and visits for a couple months and that's it, you know. And I was very violent in prison. There was nothing to stop us. There were no consequences. In 2008, I stabbed an inmate for being a child molester and a H.I.R.E, which is Skinheads Against Racial Prejudice, because you have anti-racist skinheads as well. You have African-American skinheads, you've got Mexican skinheads. I mean, you have skinheads of all different cultures. The ones that generally get the focus are generally the Nazi skinheads, because there's a lot more publicity around that. And actually some of the first skinheads were Jamaican, believe it or not. And there's still an active skinhead scene in Jamaica. So, but I stabbed this inmate 29 times and was sent to, this was at USP Coleman in Florida. And I was sent from there to the ADX Supermax in Colorado, which is the federal Supermax prison. It's supposed to be the most maximum security prison in the US, although some people would say Pelican Bay can rival it. I was sentenced to 5 years of solitary confinement, which turned into 8.5 years. And it was there that, you know, you have a lot of time in solitary confinement to really do a lot of introspection. And so I began to read and study and try to figure out like why I had developed into this person. And so I didn't like who I'd become. I felt like I was betrayed by the skinheads because I was a hammer skin, and the hammer skins on the street, if you smoke marijuana, we're going to put you in the hospital because you're a drug user. You're not one of ours. But I get to prison and these hammer skins are shooting heroin. Me and only like 3 others actually did not use drugs and cared more about the movement. And so after stabbing this H.I.R.E, I felt betrayed because another inmate who was a hammer skin refused to stab a guy because he had an anti-Nazi tattoo and he was doing heroin with the guy. And so I was like in the hole getting ready to go. And I was like, I am the only one that is seemingly believing in this stuff. And so by the time I got to the Supermax, I really started to like just back away from it. And I got a lot of flack. I got death threats when I told people I was leaving. You know, there's a lot of people who thought I was ratting immediately. And it's like, no, it's just, I'm not a skinhead no more, you know? And it's like in prison, you're still required to be there for race riots. And I said, hey, I'll still be there if a race riot happens for my own safety. I'm going to have to be where I be. And a lot of people couldn't accept that. And so to finally get away, I began working with organizations that promoted anti-racist stuff. I started reaching out to a guy I had actually threatened prior to my incarceration, Darrell Lamont Jenkins. He's a guy who runs One People's Project. And we became good friends. We've been friends since I started writing him in 2011. And I had tried to begin to deprogram myself. I didn't receive any help in prison, quite frankly. Prison is just a warehouse. At least the federal prisons I was in, because they were maximum security and they were high, they didn't care about rehabilitating you. Even though that most people in those prisons are getting out, there was very little rehabilitation, and there were stipulations to it. Like you had to have a certain percentage of time out of trouble. Well, it's like I'm in a maximum security USP, and it's hard to stay out of trouble. I mean, even if it's very hard to stay out of trouble at some of these USPs. I mean, we averaged about 7-8 stabbings a week at USP Florence. And at the time, I mean, it's different now, but so I began reaching out to these people. And then in 2016, I began teaching criminology classes with the assistance of the professor was teaching the class, but I was assisting him on white extremism and hate crimes for George Mason University, and just began fully separating myself. It was a really hard decision for anybody who's been to prison. You know, like, I never liked anybody who cooperated with law enforcement, but I reached out to law enforcement because a former skinhead associate of mine had planned on getting out and killing people. And I reached out, unfortunately, that they couldn't do much because there was no direct evidence, you know, and he got out and killed 4 people on a racial killing spree. But that actually made my time the last couple of years hard, because now I was labeled a rat, and I went to, in California, it would be called a SNY yard or special needs yard or whatever. And it was hard for me because I spent 3 years in the law library and began studying the law. And I'm actually the one who got my crime overturned through my hard work, and my count 1 rather, because I was guilty, and I do deserve to be consequented for that. I just felt my sentence of 39 years was excessive. And once the statute was invalidated, I got that. But the last 3 years were very hard because I went to one of these dropout yards, as they're known, and it was a sex offender. And so it's like, here I am being around the people that I despise most. And but I just tried to focus on bettering myself as a person. And I mean, I spoke with Bethany quite a bit, and I just, you know, I told her about my struggles. I mean, at one point I tried to kill myself several times. You know, I've been to the outside hospital for that, and you know, solitary wasn't easy. I mean, there was probably a time when I genuinely lost my mind in the Supermax. You know, I mean, you know, humans are a social creature, and when you're there for 8.5 years in solitary confinement, it's kind of hard to, you know, find that social need. So I used to be violent and have the guards run in on me with the sword team just to feel something, you know, to feel some type of human contact. And so last year in 2020, the prosecution ceded my motion because the statute applied to me, and the judge ruled in my favor the next day on my birthday. And I was 30 years was removed from my sentence. And so I knew I was getting out. I didn't know when. It took about 4 months because of COVID, because the courts were shut down and there was various issues. And they just came to me one day and said, hey, you got 2 hours to leave. Here's $75 and a plane ticket. And so they flew me from USB Tucson in Arizona back to Spokane. No type of preparation, no type of rehabilitation, anything. I had, you can't see it now because I've got them lasered, but I had 2 Doc Marten boots on my face with red laces because skinheads wear Doc Martens. I had what's called a Triskelion or a 777, which was a Nazi logo on my chin. I had skinhead on my knuckles, SS bolts on one hand, and a swastika on the other. So I had no preparation, no job skills. I was 36 years old, and after 16 years and 2 months, they let me go. And I've been doing good since. I got out, and a lot of people that I've talked to in prison used to actually frustrate me a lot. I used to get really angry at people because I wanted a second chance, but you had these people who were low-level offenders, but they would come back in, back and forth, back and forth. It was like a revolving door. And actually, a lot of violent offenders actually, if they are released, have a lower recidivism rate. I used to read that in Prison Legal News and see some of the statistics on that. But they would, oh, it's impossible. You can't succeed out there. The probation makes it so hard. And, you know, quite frankly, if you excuse my language, it's bullshit. It's been simple. It's just easy. You don't do drugs. You don't own a firearm. You don't break the law. It's like, what's so hard about that? You know, it's like I got out. I had no resources. I just called around places and was like, hey, how much to remove my tattoos? And one guy was like, hey, you know what? I was a junkie and got out of prison and nobody gave me help. I'll remove your tattoos for free. And he lasered my face and my hands off, you know, and a lot of people don't seem to want to make that effort when they get out, because it's just as simple as picking up a call, you know, a phone and making a call. And a lot of people think that they're going to be told no. So that, you know, I mean, I got 10, 15 places told me no before this guy, you know, I was offering to pay for it. And he just texted me photos of it. And I texted him photos of the tattoos. And there you go. You know, and a lot of people just give up when they're told no one or two times. And, you know, that's one thing I think people that are getting out would be very beneficial, is to just know that if you keep showing perseverance, people will give you a chance. My second day out, I was fortunate enough, my brother owns a company, so I got a job plastering. And within the last year, I got engaged to my ex-wife that I married when I was in the Army. She too has left the movement and is against racism. I fought my first MMA fight at the age of 37 and beat a 20-year-old kid, which made me feel kind of good. Old man still got a couple ones left in him. I got a fight actually next Friday, so it's going to be exciting there. I actually reached out to an MMA gym, and like I didn't have any friends because all my friends were skinheads and were just, you know, people that you know I didn't want to associate with anymore. And the gym has become a family to me. I mean, and it's crazy, like it's very diverse. And like my coach is Cuban and he is like a father to me. He's just a great man. And one of my best friends, Terrence McKinney, is an African-American man who just won his UFC debut with a 7-second knockout a couple of months ago. So it's like, it's really cool. And like, we've been giving him rides to the gym. So me and my fiance, who used to hate this man, are now helping him achieve his goals and his dreams. And it's like, I'm 37. I'm never going to be in the UFC, but to be able to be part of that and to be part of his story really feels good. I got a Ford Mustang and paid it off. And then I got an 2008 F-350, and I sold the Mustang, unfortunately, but I had to get into a house, and I bought a house within a year of getting out. It's a crappy trailer, but you know, it's a start. And I started Spokane Community College September 20th, and you know, the counselors there want me to take social work, or they even asked me to do pre-law when I told them I did my own legal work. But I don't, that's just doesn't interest me. I want to work with at-risk youth, but I love working on mechanical stuff. So I'm taking the diesel mechanics program because, I mean, they start you off at $40 an hour, and I can always teach diesel mechanics to like youth who don't have any resources and stuff like that. So that's my plan in the future. And it's an associate's that's transferable to a bachelor's. So that's probably going to be my goal. Other than that, I mean, life's just been great. I mean, it hasn't been easy. I'm not going to lie and say every day has been easy. I mean, there's been times I've been depressed and wanted to kill myself since I've been out. And it ain't, you know, I think in a lot of ways I have regrets about the way my life's turned out. You know, a lot of the potential I had with education, with even as fighting. You know, it's like I was at the gym. I'm wondering. I see these young kids, and I'm like, damn. I wonder if I had been here at 20, if I would have done this. You know, I mean, I've been in the UFC. Could I have done this? Who knows? You know, I've never been knocked out yet. So it's like maybe, but I doubt it, you know, and it's, you know, I've tried to reach out to, because I wrote letters to the synagogue that I firebombed while I was in prison. And the rabbi there, she was very nice. While I was in prison, she talked to me about a term called a shuv, which is a turning towards atonement and making up for your past wrongs. And I've tried to live my life by that now as much as I can. And I tried to reach out to them. I kind of felt like their message was kind of hypocritical because they told me not to contact them and called the U.S. attorney. And once the U.S. attorney and my probation officer said, do not contact, I was like, okay. But it was just, it seemed to like, I don't know. And without speaking with them, I don't know what, you know, I don't hold any animosity anyway, but I just felt like, you're telling me you forgive me and you want to work with me while I'm in prison, but after I get out, the message changed, you know, and I don't hold that against them. I understand there's probably a lot of, maybe they wanted me to be in prison for the rest of my life. And, you know, I disagree with that, but I definitely did deserve to get put in prison for my crime. You know, I was wholly guilty. No one else did it but me. So, but then again, you know, I don't want to make it seem like I'm the victim here because they definitely are. And but I've been trying to do what I can. I just filmed a documentary this weekend with the local sheriff here. And one of the things we talked about was me working with at-risk youth in the Spokane area. So I'm hoping that I could do that, work with gang members, drug users, or whatever to try to help them. You know, I kind of have like a little bit of a different, you know, attitude about certain things because I believe you make a choice, you know, and so I'm real big on personal choice. And so like I don't like to sugarcoat it to the kids. Like if you're gonna do drugs, I'm gonna tell them you're gonna screw up your life. You're gonna be an idiot, you know. And some kids don't like to hear it that way, but I'm kind of come from that hard love attitude, you know. I don't try to sugarcoat it to them. So, is there any questions? I don't know what else.
I was just gonna say, thank you, Sean, so much for that. And I appreciate you sharing and obviously being vulnerable, right, and sharing your story. Very powerful story, I'm sure, as everyone can hear. So yeah, definitely want to open up. I'm sure there's probably questions or comments. So I'll open it up to everybody if you guys have any questions. Paul?
Yeah.
I was like, nobody?
Mr. Kim.
Hey, Sean, how are you?
Good.
Call me Paul, by the way.
Okay. Okay, Paul.
Thank you, by the way, for sharing. That's true. I don't think people realize how difficult it can be to really come to terms with the problems that you've suffered and to gain an understanding of that. And it sounds like you've had a lot of introspection. So I wanted to first of all thank you for sharing. I know that it took a long time for you to get comfortable with where, and understand where all this came from. My question to you is, if you know somebody that's suffering from, like, let's say, a drug addiction, what's the most effective way to reach them? Because just telling them to stop drinking, just telling them to stop smoking, just telling them to stop, doing drugs doesn't work in and of itself. So having been there and having, overcome this yourself, what's your advice to somebody who's trying to help somebody else deal with an addiction?
See, that's kind of a struggle for me because I was shooting heroin, and when I started hanging out with skinheads, I stopped cold turkey. I got sick, but I believe if you put something in your mind, you're going to do it. And so it's hard. I know everybody has differences the way they deal with addiction and whatnot. So it is kind of something I've kind of struggled with because, like, for example, my Army buddy, one of our friends, he did like 6 tours and he's received a Purple Heart and he has severe PTSD and he's severely addicted to drugs. And when we finally talked, because I had never met him before prior to my incarceration, stealing from my friend. And so I was like, you need to be a friend and stop doing drugs and make that decision, and so it's easy for me to say that, but when when you're an addict, it's kind of hard. And I don't really know how I deal with that. I mean, it's not something, I make an effort not to be around drug addicts, because I know I was like, even in prison, I don't know if it at the time I thought it made me better than a lot of prisoners because it was like, I don't do drugs, you guys are wrong, especially like amongst the white inmates. And so it's like, that's one thing that actually has stuck with me is like, I've been like, crazily in the past, violently anti-drug, where if somebody was using drugs, we would attack them. And so it's something I kind of struggle with. I know a friend of mine, she's an addiction counselor. And so she kind of gives me a hard time from time to time about me saying, you just need to stop, because to me, that's, if you're going to stop, you can stop, to me, it's a decision. Nobody forces you to put a needle in your arm, but it's easy for me to say. So.
Thank you for that. Thank you, Sean.
Anyone else? David?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, Sean, first of all, I want to thank you for sharing your life story. Clearly, it was not an easy one. Clearly, it is not an easy one. And from what little I know about it, reentry is a lifelong occupation. It ain't easy either. And you're to be congratulated on how far you've gotten. 2 things. First of all, unless you're under court order, to not contact that rabbi, and I would give it a shot. You know, you talked about teshuva. Teshuva simply means return. And yeah, it's a two-way process. Both the person who did the offense and the person who was offended have to come to terms with each other. And perhaps this rabbi didn't get a chance, or didn't give herself a chance to do that. So as I say, unless you're under court order, because I don't want you to jeopardize your own status.
I'm not under court order, but there is like when the U.S. attorney tells your probation office, you know, I don't want to do anything that can be construed as wrong. And I told my probation officer I will never contact them again, you know, because it's not worth going or dealing with any type of, oh, you can't be contacting them, even if there is no contact order in my sentencing. But it's not something I'm willing to risk right now. You know?
And I can understand that, and I'm sorry from everybody's vantage point. The third and last thing, though, you had mentioned you're staying in the Army, and there have been things in the news about racist groups that are active within the Army. Since you were within the Army, would you care to comment about the veracity of that? Is it really true?
I mean, I've met people who are individuals, but I know like there's a white supremacist that I'm sure Mr. Kim is familiar with in California named Tom Metzger, who's you know,
even I know about
they call him. You know, one of the things that Tom Metzger likes to talk about is how we've infiltrated this, we've infiltrated that, and it's simply not true. But he scares people with it. It creates a fear because you don't know, and you know that's what's like I was just doing this documentary. It was about the extremist movement on both sides, the left and the right in America, and you know that was one thing I tried to emphasize with them, is because they were like, oh, is there other people just waiting? And is there racist people in the military? Yes, but it was white NCOs and white officers that are the ones that gave me the discharge. And they said, we do not tolerate racism in our United States Army. And they stood up for the 7 Army values, which honestly I hadn't at the time, you know. And so, you know, I mean, I don't believe it's a widespread problem. I believe there is individuals, you know, Timothy McVeigh, obviously, but he himself was like a lone wolf. He didn't really work with any people. So, is there people who are members? Yes. And I think a lot of people in the military have a conservative nature generally. So I think that kind of gives that perception, because there is a lot of, doesn't necessarily mean everybody who's conservative is racist, but there's a lot of overlap in a lot of the belief systems that can be misconstrued too.
Well, once again, thank you for sharing your story.
No problem.
Thank you, Sean. Any other final questions for Sean or Paul?
For Sean, what is your goal now that you're home? I know you have your MMA fighting, but what do you want to do with the insight that you have?
I definitely want to work with at-risk youth. Like I said, I want to get my degree right now and focus on that, but I plan on seeing what I can do with the sheriff in the meantime. You know, I'm not going to school 7 days a week, so I will have time to do something. Eventually I want to, you know, get my own place. I've always wanted my own farm. My grandfather had a farm and I want one. And, you know, I love nature, so I'd love to do that. But I mean, there's various organizations that take youth out. I'm trying to remember the name of the one. I have their information, and they've contacted me when I was in prison. Said they would certify me. They take urban youth to places from like Chicago, New York, LA, and they take them out on camping trips and stuff. And I'm trying to, I have their information. I just can't remember the name of the organization off the top of my head. But maybe doing something like that on my weekends or something would be fun. Really just live my life as a normal citizen, you know. I can go hunting with a bow. You know, my probation officer said I'm allowed to do that. So, I mean, you know, I just want to live my life and do some of the stuff I've missed out on, you know. me and my fiance have talked about having children, and you know, we were married 20 years ago. We're going to get remarried again. We've also talked about adoption and fostering even. I believe a guy at the gym said you can actually foster kids as a felon as long as you don't have a sex offense here in Washington. So maybe that'll be an option somewhere down the line once we get financially established and stuff.